tere õhtust kõigile. Hello everybody. Kas te võiksite anda märku, et meid on hästi kuulda chatis näiteks mingi ühe lausega? Could you just let us know in one sentence in the chat if the sound is okay? Okay, good. Yeah. Here I switched to English because we have English speaking people here. And just as a small introduction to the series, this is Ensemble U sitting here with Kerry Kotta in the middle as a guest. And we are at the moment in Tallinn, Estonia. It is very cold, as you can see. We are wearing all these jackets and stuff, because in the bar we are at, in Estonia Composers Union bar, it's a bit chilly, but nevertheless we are very enthusiastic about the subject. Ensemble U, as you probably know, is an ensemble that has been around for 15 years about, and besides playing concerts, we also have other activities. You can check them on our website, uu.ee. And one of those activities involves this kind of open discussions and like kind of workshops and such. And this is what we are doing also today. We have actually organized the series, as we call it, Residentuu, residency, already 2-3 years, and it has normally been around composer or some certain composer's music. So we have had these kind of public working sessions which have ended with some kind of public concert. But this year it will be different. Because these 5 meetings what we have together with you, these are centered around the subjects of music criticism. Because it's a subject what is very often talked about among musicians, among composers, scientists, but it seems that there are many people who are not happy with the current state of music criticism, at least in Estonia. And I have an impression that also elsewhere the matter is very complicated and there are very many problems in it and a lot of misunderstandings. What are the expectations from this subject at all from the different sides? And so this year's residency program, as I said, it's dedicated to the problematics of criticism and all kind of subjects related to new music critics. In the first opening session, we have invited Jeremy, our friend from Canada, and Kerry here in Tallinn to join us. We would like to start this opening event with trying to map, where we are in this music criticism. How do we understand it even, and how to kind of define it or what. And also we would like to maybe briefly discuss what are the expectations from different sides to it. And then Jeremy has prepared also a small speech or a small talk. Yeah, talk describing the situation of music critics or how it has changed over the last decade. But yeah, so if I may, then oh yeah, and one more thing, we are also doing it in YouTube at the moment, in case Zoom wouldn't work. And if you want to say something, if you want to join in with comments or protests, then please open your mic and we hear you, and you're very much welcome to participate actively in this discussion. And we will also start to post some links for reading proposed by our guests related to the topics. And these links will appear in our Facebook page and also on our own website, uuu.ee. So this is the ensemble's website. So, Tarmo, maybe we try to or we let Jeremy do the talk first, and then we go to the questions.
Yes, I guess we have a lot in our minds. We had quite a nice discussion already before and many of these days, and I think it's already working in a way that we have already this communication and sharing of ideas. But maybe as a good starting point, Jeremy, if you will, maybe join in and we'll listen to you.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well.
Great. Wonderful. Thanks for inviting me, Tarmo and Tavi and everyone. It's a real pleasure to be connecting with you from Canada again and taking part and being involved in your ongoing activities. So I'll just introduce myself super quickly and get on. I've prepared a small little PowerPoint presentation that I thought would be helpful in opening this this kind of discussion in the series. So I have some questions, that are I kind of thought would be good to as a way of generating some dialogue, and I have some you know some more kind of specific things that I wanted to bring to the conversation, just as a way of illustrating some of the you know, some of the thoughts that I've been having about music criticism since Tarmo asked me a few months ago, I guess, to take part in this. But so I look forward to hearing everybody's thoughts. But so my name is Jeremy Strawn. I'm a musicologist based in Ottawa, Canada. And I work on a number of different kind of research topics, but related to kind of contemporary music and experimentalism and so on. But I think my connection to Ensemble U and Estonia is the work that I've done on Udo Kazanets, who celebrated his centenary in November of 2019 with a conference that I think probably several people here were aware of or at. So one thing about Udo, aside from being an Estonian-born, Canadian-based experimental composer, was that he was also a very prominent music critic, actually, which preceded his reputation as a composer. And in many ways, he's more known outside of his sort of community here in Canada as a critic than he is as a composer. So I'm going to talk about him a little bit. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint here. Let me just call that up. Let's hang on a second. Okay, can you see that okay? I'm not sure what view, if that's better. Does that look okay? I'll just assume that it does. And if there's any issues, maybe just pop in the chat or come off of mute and tell me. So these are some of the questions that I've been thinking about based on some of the preliminary discussions that we've had via email and you know, sort of over the phone, over the computer and such, is that you know, the idea of what is the role of the music critic in sort of contemporary musical culture right now is something that I think this series or this year's workshop is aimed at addressing. Where is the kind of trajectory of the critic, and where has the kind of critic come from, and how has that role changed? And I guess before I go on, I also just want to say thanks again for allowing me to talk in English and doing this in English. It's obviously makes things a lot easier from my perspective. So, how do we define the role of the critic? And some of these words here, and I hope they're clear. I hope the translation is clear. But the differences between the idea of music criticism, musical critique, or the idea of musical criticality. And when I say the word criticality, I'm not just trying to sound smart or anything, but it's this notion that the music that critics are writing about, I mean, it's not just about the idea of offering, the criticism of it, but thinking about and kind of refining, I guess, the way that we think about music in a more critical lens, I guess. And to me, that seems especially relevant in new music criticism or experimental or avant-garde music, whatever you want to call that, because it seems like the role of the music critic in this particular kind of field is as one of almost like a translator and sort of making the incomprehensible more comprehensible or digestible or palatable to the supposed lay person. And that kind of, translates or flows into this other idea of like, well, is a music critic then, are they somebody who's like a gatekeeper or an arbiter? Like, are they a cultural arbiter in the sense that are they the ones that are sort of there to legitimize any particular music composer, performance, composition, practice, genre, and so on and so forth? And how has that role come into play in the last 50 years? When did the music critic become, how did they evolve into this position of authority? And that's one of the readings that I suggested people take a look at was thinking about that. Or this idea of advocacy, I think, which will come up later when we're talking about, I think, more contemporary modes of disseminating music criticism on blogs, social media, and that so on and so forth. Is the critic somebody whose primary role is to kind of advocate for a particular composition or composer or a particular community, to have a voice for that community in an otherwise competing landscape of media voices and kind of a crowded landscape of venues, forums, places for expression, and so on and so forth. So, but that also kind of, makes me wonder, well, so what are the kind of environments that the critic exists in? And it seems like when we were having conversations about this earlier, a few of these kind of overlap. And so there's this idea that, the music critic is somebody who has a background in, publicity or journalism or music theory or musicology. And so is a music critic, are they, is the role of the critic to kind of explain in this kind of cultural way, or to, for example, a lot of analysis is considered criticism. They have to explain what's going on in a piece by Stockhausen, or they have to explain the musical processes that are happening in, Reshevsky or complexity, new complexity music, that kind of thing, right? So that sort of assumes that there's a kind of theoretical aspect to it. But then there's this whole other side of like, well, the critic is different from the theorist or the musicologist in the sense that the critic is somebody who's kind of operating in a more of a journalistic or promotional kind of capacity in newspapers and magazines and blogs, journals that are more trade-based and not academic journals. So there's that kind of dimension of music criticism as well too, right? So it's interesting when we sort of really think about what the role of the music critic is and how it's evolved. It's a little bit more complicated than simply just saying somebody that's writing about music or reviewing concerts. There's all of these other aspects. And one other thing that I wanted to sort of have us keep in mind too is this idea that there's this sort of interchanging role between the critic and the composer and the performer, but more throughout the last, I would say, since 60s, 70s, this idea that, and Will Robbins' piece from his dissertation sort of touches on this a little bit, is that composers themselves sort of function as surrogate music critics, or they assume the role of the music critic and their authority to kind of explain their own work or explain their own kind of music to an audience. What the that author of the the article in the Journal of American Musicology that I that's posted on the website talks about the music lover, the average music lover, and some of these other things too. The idea of a critic as a gatekeeper, interlocutor, sort of somebody who has to translate to me, that seems really resonant. But these three words at the bottom of the screen that I put there sort of came up in our earlier conversations. This idea of infrastructure, influence, and impartiality. So that music critics operate not in a vacuum or not in a kind of abstract space, but they have to have venues, publications, they have to have concert venues, journals, newspapers to sort of get that kind of discourse circulating. And are they impartial? Is there a sense of sort of distance from a work or a composer, or are they there to kind of influence this kind of debate? So those are just some of the bigger kind of things that I was sort of thinking about when we started having these conversations. Hang on, sorry. Right. So I just wanted to I don't want to bore everybody with a history lesson or anything like that, and I'm sure that some of this is old hat to you, but I just was sort of curious to think about, talking about how has the idea of the music critic changed in the last little while, but where did the idea of the music critic come from, or where did the kind of role of the music critic emerge? And it's something, it sort of takes shape, I guess, kind of in the beginning, the early modern sort of period, in England and France, 18th, 19th centuries, this idea of, that you can write about music in an abstract sense as a way of translating it to an increasingly interested public, or a public that has the time and the resources to engage with music in a more of an abstract, intellectual, emotional way. And so you have people like Charles Avison, E.T.A. Hoffmann, obviously Edward Hanslick on the beautiful in music, von Musikalisches Schönen. And it's this idea that sound can be written about from an aesthetic perspective. And to me, that seems one of the main animating things that music criticism in new music is always trying to grapple with, is sort of thinking about the aesthetics, justifying whether or not this or that piece of music is worthy of our listening attention, right? So it's this idea that there's this idea, this activity of listening that is in of itself something that is separate from other things, separate from daily life. That music itself is an abstract kind of experiential apparatus for us to engage with. And so the writing about that music in those kinds of terms becomes this kind of practice on its own. So I just wanted to sort of think about that, this idea that criticism sort of stretches back at least a couple hundred years. So one of the readings that I thought would be interesting, if anybody's looked at it, I'd be curious to discuss it with you a little more. This article that's about 40 years old now, sorry, 1981. So I chose it because I like the idea of reading something that was of its time, and something that was perhaps a generation removed from where we are now, or even 2 generations removed from where we are now. And it's an academic piece published in the Journal of the American Musicological Society, which if it's not familiar to any of you listening here, is the main academic forum in musicology in North America. It's the premier journal, and so it's kind of a standard bearer of academic writing, and has been for quite some time. And so this particular piece argues for a very particular kind of music criticism, one that tries to define the role of the music critic in this relationship with other sort of para-musical actors, not performers, not composers, but this idea that in the musical world that we live in, there's there are people who do things around music, people who teach music, people who review music. But then the critic is something separate. And so this author has this interesting way of thinking about the critic as somebody who has all of these kinds of capacities built in, the musicological. So they have the sort of cultural history that they can draw from, the technical expertise, right? The music critic is somebody that understands the bones of a piece of music, can actually think about structures and you know, the parts that make up an actual composition musically themselves. But also he talks about this idea of experiential elements of criticism, the idea of having known what it is to sort of listen actively to music, critically to music and stuff. So I really did just want to bring that out a little bit. One of the things that I wanted to also sort of take away from this particular reading as well too is that the author here is engaged in a kind of what I call a scorist orientation of the critic, in the sense that in this particular reading, he's coming from the point of view that the score, the musical score, is the essence of meaning in a piece of music, and that the critic should be sort of thinking about a performance as a kind of score itself, right? You know, there's a quote: "A valid critique is one that draws from correct inferences from verifiable facts." So it's this idea that a music critic can't step out of the world that is being presented to them by a performance of music. And the reason, you know, I think this particular author is taking this direction in this piece is that he is responding to a moment in kind of cultural critique of the 70s and early 80s, and especially North America, but with the influence of European thinkers like Derrida and Foucault and all those, you know, the emergence of a kind of literary criticism. You know, he talks about textualists and deconstructionists. And I think this particular author is trying to push back against that kind of this sort of overwhelming authority of interpretive freedom in literary studies as it's being applied to music. And he's saying, listen, we need to step back and we need to really remind ourselves that the role of the music critic is not to sort of overshadow what's happening in a particular piece of music. The role of the critic is to kind of present that meaning in the music in a way that remains faithful to that composition. And I just thought it was funny. He talked about the Freudian Dutchman and the Marxist Nibelungs. You know, that's a little shot against, you know, literary criticism and deconstructionism and textualism and all these kinds of trends that I think we're starting to, you know, kind of determine where music criticism is headed. And so I just wanted to bring attention as well too. There's a sort of a bit of a fault in the argument that he has here. If anyone picked up on this, if they read it, was that, you know, the author is saying that, you know, the critic is a kind of key actor in this like drama between the composition and the performance. So what in this, to me, what's kind of useful to think about is that the role of the critic in this particular author's formation is that he's there to, or they are there, excuse me, to kind of interpret or sort of resolve the tension between the interpretive differences of a composition and its performance. So if you're performers and you're working with a score, you know that there's always going to be that one sort of deferral of meaning between the score and the performance, and then the meaning that gets conveyed to the audience. And so the critic in this author's formulation is an important part of that kind of chain of process of transmission, to say, here's what's going on in the performance and the composition for the listeners, so that they can understand that there's all of these complexities and, you know, deferrals or meaning and interpretive, you know, kind of aporias here. But then he goes on sort of at the end, he just says, well, I don't understand John Cage. And I guess John Cage's, you know, Imaginary Landscape for 12 Radios is a composition, but I don't know, I just don't get it. So is that music? Blah, blah, blah. And I just thought that was an interesting way of, you know, thinking about, you know, new music and experimental music, and sort of the way that the critical authority can kind of get lost in that sense. And so that's why I put up, you know, is there a limit to the kind of music critic? I wanted to maybe bring things into a little more focus by talking about Udo Kazimierz just a little bit. As I mentioned earlier on in my talk, Udo Kazimierz, aside from being a prolific Cajun-influenced composer who settled in Canada in the post-war period and became a kind of important figure in experimental music, certainly in Toronto, but also in Canada, and made connections all through North America with people like Gordon Muma and Cage himself, and all of these communities. Was a prolific music critic, and that's kind of how when he started his musical career in Canada, he was a bit of a journeyman, a do everything kind of guy. He was a conductor, he was a teacher, and then he got a job at the Toronto Daily Star, which was one of the major newspapers in Toronto at the time and in Canada, and started as a concert critic reviewing local music events, and eventually became a staff writer with his own column, which allowed him to sort of editorialize or write more of a kind of an opinion to sort of present his view of music rather than just writing concert reviews, which is what he initially started to do. And so over the course of the 4 years, he became this kind of influential figure in music criticism in Toronto, as a kind of progressive thinker, as a kind of advocate for modernism and for the avant-garde, really. And one of his main projects as a critic, and it eventually got him fired as a critic from the Star, was that he became increasingly more enthusiastic or zealous about new music and trying to update listening culture in Toronto. It's this term that I kind of coined a few years ago when I was writing about Udo, that he was part of activating this listening culture in the city. Following his work at the Star, he wrote, you can see here on the screen, these are just some of the other places that he wrote. There was a magazine that existed for a while in the early 60s called the Canadian Music Journal. And interestingly, as soon as John Cage's 1961 book, Silence, came out, Udo wrote an extremely long and thorough review of it, which is remarkable that something so extensive appeared in a Canadian publication that early. So he was reporting not just on local concerts, but also on broader changes in music, which are, a part of his role as a critic. And again, you can just see some of the other places that he wrote, but a couple highlights: Musical Quarterly and Source Music of the Avant-Garde. Again, he was publishing in in publications that had an international audience. So the Musical Quarterly was a significant academic publication, and he was reviewing the Avant-Garde Once Festival that many here will probably be aware of in Ann Arbor in the early 60s, a really important kind of annual festival for experimental music that sort of happened throughout the 60s. But from the 80s until the 2000s is where his writing kind of changes, and he starts to publish regularly in Music Works, which is a long-running experimental music magazine in Canada. It's been around for 40 plus years now. And his writing, and some of these examples are also on I gave them to put up on the Ensemble Oo's website, just a snapshot of some of the things that he was writing about. So his music writing was, his preferred genre for music writing was, text pieces, poetry, critical opinion essays, in-depth interviews. He would be critiquing a composer, their ideas, and eventually his writing became a little bit too unruly for Music Works, and he was also fired. He was let go from that position after 30 years of writing, because his interpretive I guess strategy for music criticism became a little bit too much for the magazine to handle. So that's just a quick overview of how Udo was working as a music critic over the course of his life here in Canada. And I put this little slide up here as well too, just to give you an idea, a visual idea of some of the pieces that he published. And you can see images of Udo there from his time at the Star in the 60s. And I think I put up this slide when I came to Tallinn in November 2019 to talk, so it's some of you may have seen it before. But I wanted to highlight here, if you can see right in the middle, there are two blue highlighted spots here in this one article, and this is from 1963. And I just simply wanted to show this kind of ecosystem between composers and music critics. So here, if you can see that, there's a piece that Udo wrote, just a short, he filed a concert review for the Star as a writer, staff star writer Udo Kazimierz right here. But then right here is an incredibly negative review of his own concert that happened the night before, Men, Minds, and Music, which is one of his early sort of experimental music projects, avant-garde music series in Toronto. Actually, it's considered to be the first avant-garde music series in Canada that he was involved with. So it's just sort of interesting to me that you can see, even on the same page, there's this kind of tension between the critic and the composer and how these debates were sort of playing out. I want here to show you one more example as well too. So I have this title, Kazimierz Contra Critics. So what you're seeing on the screen here is a review published in Maclean's magazine, which is a an arts and culture magazine that's been around in Canada since the 60s, if not earlier. But this is a review of a happening or an event that Udo Kazimierz put on in 1966, part of his Isaac's Gallery and Mixed Media concerts. And this review was, again, a fairly negative, almost mocking write-up of a concert that Udo organized. And it got a fairly big, it was a full page spread in the magazine. And this would have been a national readership. So it's kind of an important moment in sort of music criticism here in Canada, that this kind of experimental project that Udo was doing was given an audience to readers across the country who would have had otherwise no idea. And as you can see here, it's a fairly condescending write-up of it. So of course, Udo did not like that, and he wrote into the magazine to complain, letter to the editor kind of thing. And I won't keep it, you don't have to read this whole thing. I'm just showing these to give you some archival kind of material here. The editor wrote him back saying, thanks, I've passed this on to the author, and here's the author's response. And then Udo's response eventually gets published in the magazine. So I guess what I wanted to sort of illustrate from that point of view is that, or that example is that, in this age of sort of music criticism in the 60s, kind of, it's this period of high musical cultural arts criticism, and these kinds of debates and exchanges were sort of playing out in this critical space in magazines for audiences to read. To me, that's a remarkable kind of moment in music history, especially here in Canada for sure, but I'm thinking more in the 20th century North American new music context, that these new ideas were given voice in fairly national publications. So as a way of just wrapping up what I wanted to say about Udo is that he was writing about music as his own kind of paracompositional practice that was not separate itself from music, from the idea of a music critical practice itself. It was part of the same. And so in the 60s, he was thinking about the idea of placing the local in a kind of dialogue with broader international trends. That was his thing. He's always talking about how can the music critic be a voice for local musicians and composers and put them into kind of context with these bigger trends that are sort of happening to give their work more meaning and more weight. And as I said earlier, I just sort of used this term listening culture in relation that he was a part of really trying to advocate and activate in the 1960s. But later, his writing kind of blurs these distinctions between sort of poetry and philosophy and theory and criticism and all that kind of stuff, and also musicology as a writer for music works and elsewhere. And as we move into this other reading, that I'll sort of close out on with Will Robbins' reading, talking about the blogosphere, is that like, the composer can sort of, it's not just Udo, you have this tradition of composers writing about music in a critical capacity as a way to sort of bridge the divide between their work and the work of their community members, other composers, and an audience that would otherwise have no awareness of that kind of thing. So they act as these critical interlocutors or interlocutionary roles to kind of shape their own worldview and their own compositional worldview. But I wanted to, just briefly talk about the reading from Will Robin. He's a colleague of mine. He's a professor at the University of Maryland. And you can see he just has a new book out. If anybody's interested, brand new, coming out from Oxford University Press. He's actually, I think, giving a talk today at, I can't remember where, somewhere in the UK, I think, about his book. So if you're interested, just a plugging Will's new book. It's called Industry Bang on a Cannon, New Music in the Marketplace, brand new. But in Will talks about this this sort of moment in new music criticism in the sort of late 2000s to mid 2010s, where the blogosphere or blogs they kind of replace traditional forums of music criticism as this kind of decentering of musical authority. So it's not the gatekeepers like the Alex Ross, of the New Yorker and New York Times, those kinds of sort of official music critics, but the space where music criticism happens sort of becomes displaced throughout the internet. And so he talks about this idea of mediation by self. So composers are able to mediate their own music and their own ideas through these blogs, essentially. But so it's this kind of tension between new media, the internet, and legacy media, sort of print, all that kind of stuff. And Will sort of recognizes that this is a moment in time, and the blogosphere has kind of declined, and it's been replaced by things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and the kind of re-centralization of social media by social media companies that are now determining who hears what. And does that have an impact on the project of music criticism, right? So that's kind of my presentation, actually. I'm going to stop sharing it there. And I'd be, curious to hear thoughts, or I hope that was kind of coherent and productive for generating some beginning conversations about where music criticism has been, what its role is, what its uses are. So thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Great talk. Thank you. I would like to ask right away, would you agree to share also the PowerPoint slides to the links, what we will share? Just, there were some really nice keywords and stuff written down. I don't know if you would agree, then we would be happy to look at it later as well.
Yeah, I'll just I'll send that off right away. Yeah.
Super, thank you. Before we go to just to discuss some questions, and by the way, Tiina had risen a hand. Tiina, kas te soovisite midagi küsida? Do you want to ask something or comment something previously, Tiina? Maybe no. I take it as a no. Yes. But yeah, before we go to the some terms and some questions what we have, I would ask maybe directly from our guest, Kerry, whether he would have any comments or thoughts after Jeremy's talk. So I give the microphone to Kerry for any comments there might be.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy, for this. Maybe I just will comment on a bit from our Estonian perspective. Well, and maybe I will focus on this article by Cohen you actually mentioned several times and reviewed shortly. Yes, that's true that actually Cohen considers to be let's say a proper critic, the third type, which actually who is a music lover, yes, essentially, and who is trying to explain another or try to uncover for another music lover what the musical piece is about. But yes, he mentions also so-called two other types, the reviewer and then so-called the teacher critic. Well, as far as I understood this article, Cohn didn't say that these two types are not, I mean, these activities cannot be related to the musical criticism. I think they have their part, but I think that the focus, I mean, the first part of the article was that actually it depends on the audience. I mean, what the audience you are referring, because the reviewer, I mean, it's a kind of different task. I mean, the reviewer has to, yes, he has to introduce a piece of music or CD or performance or a book or something else to the wider audience, and in doing so he has to use words or the style which is approachable, I mean, which is accessible to the broader audience. So his task is to tell the audience whether this book, performance, CD or work is worth listening, worth buying, and so on. But it still includes kind of criticism in there. And then there is another type, so-called a teacher critic, whose actually audience is mainly the professionals and the musicians themselves, and therefore such critic, I mean, his task is to actually help, yes, as Cohen puts it, help a musician to perform better, help a composer to compose better, and so on. So his target is professional musician rather than the listener. And finally, the critic proper, so to speak, who loves music and whose audience is mainly other music lovers. And of course, all these types exists also in Estonia in a way, but of course, I mean, it's different kind of critics. I mean, the reviews are mostly in bigger papers, yes, I think, in Estonia. Short stories about new releases, something like that. I don't know how many, I mean, today. So the proper criticism, I mean, can be mostly found in our cultural journals and weeklies, SIP and Teatermuusika Kino and so on. But of course, these kind of criticism also blurred with this called teacher critics, which is quite many of our so-called reviews or critical articles are. I mean, their target is quite often professionals and not so much music audience as such, I mean, music lovers. But I think, I mean, from Estonian perspective, I mean, these types are not, I mean, they are not so distinct as they maybe are in Anglo-American world. Well, but another point of view I wanted to comment on, because you just touched slightly the history of criticism, and if we take our so-called post-Soviet situation here, then quite many of this, which you referred to as the music criticism, or which Cohn actually refers to as the music criticism proper, is actually something which was, I mean, long in Estonia is considered mostly the main field of musicology, because I mean the musicology became so-called independent academic kind of activity or scientific field only recently, which means that mainly, I mean, throughout the 20th century, actually the musicology, I mean, the main task of the musicology was considered actually to review, to introduce the new composers, the new works to the audience. So the main, let's say, task of the musicologist was just to the criticism to be informed music lover or music professional who then informs the audience about the new music. Um, so therefore, in Estonia, I don't know what is the situation elsewhere, but in Estonia, these two things, even nowadays, I mean, if you let's say, if somebody asks you who you are, and I'm saying that, okay, I'm a musicologist, then mostly people think that musicologist is a person who actually wrote articles about contemporary music. Of course, nowadays the situation is not as such. I mean, Estonia, not anymore. Nowadays, I think most of our musicologists are not primarily concerned with contemporary music and writing about contemporary music. Yes, so okay, but maybe I will stop here now and maybe then we go on with that kind of comment from Estonian perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So if we try to kind of clarify or map the territory where we are, so as far as I read the Cone article, and I would really recommend it to read to everybody here who hasn't done it yet, then it seems that he really makes a very clear distinction between review and the critique. And if I'm trying to put it in Estonian, then it means review. We don't actually have a very good word. We thought of arvustaja because there are many Estonians now here online. But I think arvustaja is not also the good word. Maybe kajastaja we found in the Cone sense. Somebody who is describing more and then maybe giving some judgment to it. But as we understood, Cone was referring to reviewer. Main purpose would be to how to say, basically marketing, just explaining whether this, just that the reader would see whether this was the music he would or she would have wanted to hear, or to know that this for future, that this would be something that I would want to consume, so to say. Whereas critique is a much broader term and much deeper term in that sense, if I understood Cone right from this article, just in very simple ways. But in Estonia, if we come back to Estonia once again, I don't think we've also had this kind of blog culture blooming in a way it has been happening in some other places. Yes, of course, the blog culture was kind of popular in 2000s, and we all seen it happening, but I don't think we've ever had this kind of music critique blog that would be popular or people would follow. It might be so in some other field of music. I mean, like maybe I just don't know. Maybe it has been in the folk music number, or maybe in I don't know, in some pop music situation here, but definitely not in new music or classical music or such. So this is something that we never had. Yes, maybe we should. This is another question. But if we would try to come back to this issue of critic and the reviewer and such, so I didn't understand, Kerry. Would you agree with this classification? And if you do, then my proposal would be that in Estonia mainly we have in common sense reviewers, like that. This is what the vast majority that we read from even the dedicated magazines of culture are actually reviews rather than writings by critic in the common sense. Would you agree?
Maybe you have quite high standards, I think, because well, I don't know, in so-called classical or serious music or contemporary serious music, yes, I think that, well, perhaps not. I mean, if I think of reviewing music, then I think if you take it, I mean, as an Anglo-American world, then I think we have some reviews. I mean, we have a kind of review culture based on only a few authors, but mainly on more popular music. You can find some, yeah, new releases, CDs, some people, I mean, yes, reviewing these and then recommending or not recommend, even assessing them then with stars, how many stars you put, for example, and so films and maybe and so on, but not so much theories of classical music, which is understandable as the society is so small. I think that the Estonian situation is quite unique or special because we are so small, which means that yes, we have our cultural weekly SIRP, which is meant mainly for so-called serious criticism. I mean, so that this is not the marketing, but you really, I mean, articles and papers are welcome, which actually discusses the works being performed in depth and so on. But of course, usually it's not the issue, and quite many texts we can find are just let's reviewing what was going on in the concept, what were the works being performed, okay, and maybe some impressions about the concept and so on. So mainly, yes, these can be more classified as reviews, more like reviews, more than critique. Because if we take this term that critique is actually, I mean, the main task of the critic is to uncover, I mean, what is going on in it. I mean, let's say we have a performance of a new work, then the main task, according to Cohn, as far as I could understand this article, is that he or she tries to uncover the idea behind that work. So which means that he or she should be at home, I mean, at least understand its structure, and then also I mean, and in order to be able to assess the performance, because if you don't know what it is, then it's also quite, I mean, it's very difficult to say whether it was performed well or not so well, because what it means to perform something well, perhaps to convey its main idea to the audience. I mean, if through the performance this main idea is conveyed to the audience, then probably it was performed successfully or so-called well. So, which means that yes, there are quite big demands for the critic. He has to be at home with, let's say, the nutrition, the aesthetics, understand the structure. I mean, actually should be able to read the score, understand, I mean, this as a structure, and then also be able to assess the performance. I mean, also on the aesthetical level and so on. And of course, if we say that all these elements or aspects should be there in this article written as a critic, then of course, perhaps we do not have very many.
Yeah, yes, but then you mentioned, I think I like very much what you said, that I might have very high standards about it, or maybe too high was what you were saying. But then again, us as artists, we are demanded to have the highest standards, right? And then this leads me to the question of the kuidas autoriteet on inglise, authority and also and responsibility of the critique. I liked very much the Jeremy's example of Kasemets actually writing back to the critic about disagreeing with the article what was written about his concept, you know. And I don't think we actually have this. Well, as I understood, this was also a quite particular moment, also in this Canadian situation. But I couldn't recall anything like that in Estonia, that somebody would have written back, or we don't have this kind of discussion culture in that sense. I think that would be actually very interesting, because I just want to give a small example from my own recent musical career is that one of the biggest newspapers in Estonia, Eesti Päevaleht, published a review, I think it's called review, about a festival where I also did perform, and the reviewer referred to, and again, I don't want to be misunderstood here that it's not about the fact of being a positive or negative review, but it's just the responsibility, talking about responsibility of the critique. That the reviewer actually didn't understand what pieces I was playing on the concert, and referred to a piece as a long and boring improvisation, which spoiled the impression of the whole concert, which otherwise was appreciated by the writer. My musical activities are very much involved with improvisation, and therefore this wasn't an improvisation she was referring to. It was a piece written by a composer, a premiere, what we prepared with the composer, and referring to my playing as a boring improvisation actually might potentially, well, and let's exaggerate just for a discussion's sake, might actually harm my image as an improviser, which I think for me is an important part of what I do as an artist, right? And it is a big, newspaper, daily newspaper writing this, and so where is the responsibility of the critic who didn't even realize what pieces played on the concert? This is published and it's there. It's forever in the digital archives. There's something which simply it's just unprofessionally written. Talking about high standards, and so my question would be that where is there a possibility to criticize reviews, criticize the critique? Is there any mechanism that, or be it kind of like some kind of like a internal regulation of I don't know, or whether it would be a good idea to have some kind of like a possibility to answer to just unprofessional writings, just as the critic has power to just it's kind of like a one-way street in that sense. It's that you as an artist, you do your act, and then you have writing about it, and then after that you just that's it basically. That's where it ends, and there is nothing to do about it.
But did you add a commentary to that article? Because nowadays it's possible to add your comments as a
no, but I mean it's on the paper, right? I mean paper article, and it's not so much about that, but it's just I wanted to raise it as an example of responsibility of the critic, or in that case reviewer, I would call. And so which leads us also to the expectations question. What are the expectations to the reviews and the critical articles? But I talked already too long, so maybe somebody else wants to take over or comment, or maybe somebody from our Zoom session would want to comment, or Jeremy or Kerry or somebody else.
I have thoughts, but I don't want to take up too much space. So I mean, I have a few things to say, but if someone else wants to jump in, I'm happy to wait for sure.
Well, it sometimes happens actually very rare instances that there is a critic about something, and then there is a response, and maybe there is the response of the response, and so on.
In social media nowadays. Right?
Yes, in the media, media. Well, but not very often, and not in music so far as I can remember. I mean, not in classical music at least, so that there are some. So usually, yes, unfortunately, I mean, that there is an article and that's it. I mean, it would be also interesting and also very truthful for the critic himself to get kind of feedback, is it adequate or not. but I don't, well, but this question of responsibility, I don't know, this is also a kind of question of the editor, I think, of the newspaper. I mean, when he or she asks somebody to write something about, then probably, because you see, it depends on the main editor of the, I mean, if there is an editor of cultural, I mean, music or theater or culture in more general, maybe, then he or she should be, I mean, professional enough to know who are the potential people, I mean, who are actually able to write about this. But anyway, these great, let's say, big papers, they mainly represent the review culture, and it's not very often that you find there something more substantial, specifically. I mean, especially when we're talking about new music, which is even the very specific phenomenon of musicians. I mean, quite many musicians don't understand contemporary music, and but in the big papers, it's really a large audience, and this review culture. I mean, this Cohn article. I mean, there actually, yes, the reviewer. It's all. I mean, its target is a wider audience, which means that it takes. I mean, it's a very different position. He takes. So he takes the position that as an ordinary person, you probably don't like this concept. I think maybe you see, it's a review. I mean, because it depends on the audience. I don't know whether it's responsible or not. Well, of course, another issue is your own taste. I mean, how much it plays. I mean, of course, what you are doing, it's dependent on your taste, but as I remember, Cohn actually put it quite nicely that yes, the taste is there, but this is not actually the main focus of the critic. You are not expressing your own taste, because if you're just expressing your own taste, of course, it may be adequate, but you see, it's not very valuable for others. Okay, then others say, okay, you like this, you don't like that, but you see, this is not very valuable as a kind of I mean, the critic in its proper sense should be maybe the, well, the Cohn put it very nicely that it's quite the same as the performance, I mean, the musical performance of the piece. It's just a performance, but now you are using words. So, and as such, it has some value. I mean, it has, I mean, then it gives you information how such thing can be, I mean, appreciated, how it can be accessed, how it can be approached by a listener, and then it has a value also for others. But if you're just expressing your personal taste, then it's, so I don't know, I am not familiar with the article you were referring to, so I don't know, but yes, it very much seems to be.
I can also put up the link if somebody is interested.
And about the discussion and communication, we are definitely, I think, we are interested in dialogue with our ensemble and then listeners and then critics and composers. And then with the series of the Residentuu, we definitely try to a little bit enliven this situation. And our last meeting in the series in April, end of April, is after our concert in Estonian Music Days. And it's an open discussion, an open critique of our concert. And people are really welcome, either professional writers or music lovers or who have come to the concert to come here, and we can criticize the concert. And also next meetings are in March, and then in the beginning of April, we will have concerts before the meetings. And also, so we can touch the concerts and then also build connections between the actual playing and music and what we think. So I think it's very important to share the ideas, and also just in the talk or a pint of beer after the concert. It's extremely important. So, but the relation to the music, I think this is what is the most important. We were discussing before and tried to summarize, and maybe we can go on now with ideas that we musicians or performers, what do we actually need or expect from criticism?
Yes, I think it is the question where musicians get really passionate about. And I think there is a major misunderstanding in that musicians would be expecting positive review of their activities. I think we are a bit over it as a group, I guess, also, and as individuals. And it seems that the artists I'm often working with, or we are working with, are longing for a partnership or discourse and the discussion. This is what we feel is lacking a lot in at least in Estonian context, and this is like we've had many times situations where we just we wish that the critic would come to us to talk to us, to argue, to I don't know, protest, to ask for scores. And I don't think ever anybody would have come to us to see the scores. As you mentioned, I mean the critic. As you mentioned, new music critique might be slightly different from certain other music critics, right? And if we try to define what makes it different, obviously it's the lack of certain interpretation tradition of the very pieces played, because they are just new or they are premieres or so on. There is a context, true, but there is no history in playing that very piece, right? And so it's also, I think that laying this context is something that we are expecting from the music critic, because I think we deeply believe that music critics' role is to be like a part of this really musical scene, this kind of like a network of blood circulation. I think that's at least how I see a role of the music critic, to be a partner, to have a discourse with, rather than a reviewer who would market my future projects. And so I don't know. This is my opinion. I don't know if somebody has any.
I guess the thing we are expecting from the critic mainly a reflection or a different angle of the program we played, because we know how it sounds to us, but it would be really helpful also to perform programs if we knew the reflection. And the thing we also expect is the same amount of dedication to the critic as we do to preparing for the concert. So I have seen not in Estonia, but as we discussed, I've seen not only a couple of times performing abroad, that the critics also are joining in the performances.
And
Rehearsals, sorry, yes, rehearsals, sitting there in the scores and also asking questions during the rehearsals. And this might be also useful in Estonia, I guess.
But this leads us to the very painful question: why are the music magazines and weekly magazines asking for reviews rather than like more complex articles, critical articles? And I think we all might know the answer, which is probably money. Because I guess writing more complex articles are they take more time, they are much more time consuming, they are much more expensive. We could understand it when talking about some just daily magazines, but like some cultural magazines, which are anyway not so much dependent on the money of publicity. What do you think? What might be the reason? Is it just simply money, or is it just lack of interest? Or why can't in Estonia be a professional critic? I mean, the one who would just live from writing critical articles. say, about music or art or whatever?
Yes, the one reason is very simple, I think. Yes, there is no person, I think, in Estonia who can just earn living by writing critics. I mean, theoretically it's possible, but it then means that your output has to be so enormous, so fast that actually no one is capable of.
But do you think there would be an interest for such a position if it was financed properly? Or would there be, it's in such a small scene as we are, do you think it would be even possible? Or
it could be, it should be then supported by some fund or state or...
Would it make sense, do you think?
Of course it would make sense, but well, it's, yes, I think, but it's hard to find money for that because, yes, I think the one problem is definitely that actually the criticism, I mean, it's more like, I mean, loosely coincidental, random, I mean, which means that because there are no persons who are especially dedicated to musical criticism, maybe only except editors from different journals who try to find out authors, but then sometimes they have to write themselves because they have this position. Maybe they are then so-called critics who earn their living from, but they do also editorial work as well. But just freelance critics, yes, I don't think that's possible to earn living in Estonia. So this is of course one problem. Another problem is probably, yes, that we are so small that actually, I mean, there are very many areas. I mean, only speaking about culture, and there are not just enough, I mean, people, I think. Which means that everybody has to do very many different things. I mean, nowadays also musicologists, you see, in order to be, I mean, one thing, at least my personal thing is that, okay, when I want to teach at that music academy in Estonia, then it means that also have to produce so-called scientific articles, which are quite different. I mean, published in scientific journals. All other articles or other text I wrote, they are worthless. I mean, in this system, I mean, if you just write 1.1 or 1.2 articles, which is the highest level scientific peer-reviewed articles, then it's okay. But all other activities, they are not. I mean, from this system. At the same time, quite many of our, let's say, professionally educated musicologists, they also, at least not all the time, but occasionally they do other work as well and writing other things because we know that you just, I mean, in Estonia, it's not possible to focus only on one field. There are very several fields. So I think it's the lack of. Yes, and myself, I'm also feeling that sometimes, I mean, there are rather narrow time limits, and then you have to produce quite a lot, but you don't have time, you do not have resources to do that, because anyway, it's a kind of side activity.
Yes, I see that Maria has risen her hand. Would you please switch on also your camera so it's much easier to communicate, and please switch on your microphone. Go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah.
I agree, of course, with everything that Gary has just said, but I wanted to bring out this aspect that I understand that you all have great expectations for a music critic. I also do. If you haven't understand that from everything you have read from Sirp, but I just wanted to tell you that you as a musicians, you have very systematic education, but in Estonia we haven't have very systematic education for a music critique. I mean, when I was in school almost 20 years ago, I, as a musicologist, I was said that do not write music critique. It's not your job at all. So what do we expect for that?
Just for our foreign friends, could you identify yourself, who you are and what you do? Because we know you, but also there are YouTube also who might not know you, also in Canada.
My name is Maria Mölder, and I'm a music editor at SIRP, which is Estonian cultural weekly. Yes. So yes.
Yes, thank you for the comment. I think it's I think it's sad what you just said.
Yes,
What
it's
do you
sad,
think?
but it's true, and music critic is like a hobby. Young people start by doing it, and then they move to other things because it's not well-paid job, and you do it when you can while doing
But
other
what do
things.
you think? What do you think? Has it changed over the time, the situation that to become as it is now, or has it kind of always been like that for decades? How do you think it is?
Well, a bit more than 10 years ago, we had at least more publications for music critic and also for other cultural critic. And then we used to have music editors in daily papers. We don't have them over 10 years for now. And we only have them in cultural papers and magazines. So it's not easy. I do understand that musics and composers would like to have much more space for music critic, and they would even like to have more than one article per composition and for one concert and so on, but it's not possible right now.
Before I give the word to Jeremy, who has also wants to say something, I want to ask Maria just what do you think could be the solution? Because I think we all agree here that this ideally the situation could be different. For example, I'm just provoking, as an idea. So just what do you think? Maybe when I don't know, applying for money for the concert, maybe the concert organizer, for example, could also, or all the players, they could also apply for money for then critical article. Uh, I mean, of course, it sounds like I would be buying a good review. No, I mean the contrary. I mean, I don't want to know who would be writing it, but I would want to have a dialogue or how could it be done? Do you see any solution to this situation or any ideas how it could be changed? Because also in our academy we actually do have a music critique seminar. As far as I know, it's not enough probably to study it, but any thoughts how it could be changed or done?
I'm afraid the situation is more complex, and yes, the one thing is that the money is not helping to have all the concerts and compositional works in the papers and magazines. The space is also the issue. But another thing is that we have so few people who are able to write, and there are situations then I or some other editors are searching for right people who have time for a long time.
Yes, but then it's a strange paradox. We are living here then in Estonia, and that when we had World Music Days, I remember people saying that it's a complete anomaly here. We have so many composers and enthusiastic players and all that, but as a critical side, we don't have so many. I mean, as a paradox, after the biggest new music festival we had in Tallinn ever, I don't remember seeing many articles about it written afterward. I can't remember one, to be honest. Maybe I'm mistaken simply, but it's just that there is this kind of anomaly here in that regard as well. Would you agree?
Well, if I'm not talking to myself or too long, I'm back in the start where I was beginning in the beginning that we have systematical education for musicians, for composers, and so on, but we don't have systematic education for music critique. I mean, yes, there is a seminar, and I have put my time in this as well for a while to put practical part in this education. But this is not enough. And there are very few students in there.
Okay, so we are here over to but then Jeremy, would you wanted to comment on something? Sorry, I kept you so long. Please
that's ahead. Okay. Yeah, sure. I know we're kind of getting close to time, so I won't speak too long, but I just had some reactions to some of the discussion that's been happening over the last half an hour, actually. And I know that, the question is, what's the solution? And I think, that's a pretty tough question. And I think, one thing I would say is that I bet my inclination is that David Dax, who will be part of the event on April 13th, part of the workshop, he'll probably have a lot to say because he's done all of these things that we've been talking about. He's been a reviewer, he's been an editor, he's been a promoter and an artistic director at one of Canada's premier sort of new music environments, and or concert venues, excuse me. And he's kind of done this sort of these roles for a long time. So I imagine that he's going to have a lot of insight on sort of the pitfalls and the kind of possibilities and setbacks that we're kind of chewing here. But what I did want to say was that we've been talking about, there's Maria, you were mentioning, there's no systematic education for music critics in Estonia. And I mean, I think that's, certainly here. I mean, I'm also a musicologist. I've been through all kinds of, I've been through 3 degrees in music, from under bachelor all the way to a PhD. And, we don't, it's just not, it's a kind of profession. The idea of the music critic is a profession that sort of circles around all of these other systematized institutional things. So you have musicologists and you have journalists and you have performers and you have composers, but the space where music criticism happens sort of happens in all of these kinds of spaces, in the sense that a music critic has to have this fluency, this ability to kind of write with enough authority and enough kind of musical and cultural kind of knowledge that their perspective is a little bit more informed or something like that than the quote unquote listener or whatnot, which itself I think is a problematic assumption. So I want to just benchmark that. But one of the things that, again, if I can just bring it back to some of the examples of Udo Kazimierz from the 60s a little bit, is that what's changed dramatically is the media landscape has changed so fundamentally in the last 50 years, where major publications with lots of money and influence, newspapers, magazines, their sort of their hold on the media landscape has shrunk, in the same way that print media is dying, print publication is becoming more specialized and streamlined. And so what you have is the space where this kind of music criticism once predominated, where there once was perhaps not in Estonia because of its size, but I mean, even Canada is a big country, but it's a small-ish population for the size of it. But there was a time where we had professional music critics who made a living as a music critic. But now the that is an age long gone, and it's very rare that you have somebody who only does this kind of thing. And so the space where music criticism happens is kind of disseminated and found its role in other places, which is, Tavi, you're talking about the review of your concert where the critic got it completely wrong. When you think about it, that's now an historical document of that performance. And so when I was doing research on Udo Kazimierz for my PhD thesis, my main primary documents were the histories that exist in the newspaper articles and critical and reviews and concert reviews and music columns. That's kind of this history that it's this ersatz history that exists. And so you have to sort of look at that as one thing that it's interesting to me, especially in new music, is that yes, there's the question of translation and I mean, translating music for a readership that might not understand it, but there's also this kind of this sort of writing of history that happens that, I think if somebody were to go back and look at the Estonian new music scene, in 10 years, I mean, their primary documents what would they be? They'd be like oral history, and they would be, what the pieces that have been kind of written about. It's the same thing for a lot of music history. So those are just some thoughts I just wanted to, and I have more, but I understand we're at time. I just wanted to leave those there in case they're useful to anybody, just based on some of the things that I've been hearing in the conversation over the last half an hour.
Yes, thank you for that. We are our time is soon up, but I wanted to encourage viewers in our Zoom session. If you would have any questions or comments, this would be a good moment. Just open your microphone and go ahead. Welcome to comment or to object or to protest or whatever comments you might have on the subject we've had today. But if there are no active comments there, or Tarmo has probably.
No, I'm actually saying some words about the meeting, the next one, that is exactly in 1 month, 9th of March. And I'm sure it will be a really exciting one. We will have guests from Finland, Kare Eskola and then Jaani Läntsio. And Kare is really interested in the so-called storyline from the musician to, well, the music society, or what can the musicians do to give a direction to the discussion or the discourse. And then so that, if I got it correct from him, that he has a view how musicians actually can start or can be, or how they can anticipate in the critique and then what the story goes on. And then Jaani Läntsio, who has worked and then written a lot about legendary Finnish writer Jari Heikinheimo, and we will touch the subject of scandal, so how scandals sometimes happen. So I hope you will find time to join in, and feel free to write us back in Facebook or talk on the streets. Feel free to stop us, and if we have concerts, then come close, ask questions, or express your thoughts. It's always very welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Aitäh, and thank you, Jeremy, to Canada.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great fun. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Aitäh ja kohtumiseni.